Does your live stream sound like this?
The Son of Heaven rose again. Oh, trample death, where is your sting?
Do you want it to sound more like this?
Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise His name forevermore.
Hello, I'm Stephen Ballast. Welcome to my channel where I explore worship technology solutions. This video is part 4 in a series called Make My Live Stream Sound Better, where we're going to do just that. If you want to see all the equipment I'm using for this isolated live stream mix, check out the second video. And in the previous video, we set up all of our routing in Reaper and created sends from our channels to buses. Now we're to the point where we're ready to start inserting our plugins. Before we get started, there are 2 things I need to preface this video with. The first is, I'm going to be mostly showing you Waves plugins. I've kind of developed a love-hate relationship with Waves plugins over the years. The plugins are great, I'm familiar with them, I can get a mix up and sounding pretty decent quickly with them, but the Waves licensing for their plugins is a complete mess. I've wasted countless hours dealing with Waves licensing. So in my next video, we're going to go through and replace all of these Waves plugins with free plugins and see what difference it makes in our mix. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the issues with Waves that I've had then. The second thing I want to make clear is that what I'm about to show you is a starting point for a mix. These are the plugins I would put on my channels and then start listening during soundcheck or virtual soundcheck, making tweaks to settings, maybe even swapping out different plugins or adding additional plugins as needed, and really crafting my mix. Don't expect that you'll just insert these plugins, select a preset, and you're done. That's not a finished mix. And even as I show you some tweaks and little tidbits of how I set up a plugin along the way, those settings are going to be pretty specific to the environment we have here at our church. The instruments, vocalists, and mics and style of music. Hopefully you'll see how and why I'm making an adjustment and apply that, not just copy the settings I end up with. Your environment is going to be very different, and the settings and the plugins that you need could also be very different from what I'm showing you. This isn't necessarily a mixing tutorial, and it's not necessarily going to show you a finished mix. If you need help with that, I do offer consulting and would love to help you with your mix. You can look for a link for that down in the description of this video. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. There is one important requirement for the plugins we do choose to use for live mixing, and that is we have to use zero latency plugins. A plugin is just a little piece of software that processes our audio. That could be an EQ, a compressor, reverb, whatever the plugin does, and that processing takes a certain amount of CPU time. So if you think about it, as we load up different plugins onto our channels, those channels are going to start taking different amounts of time to process. Your DAW is going to be marching along at the sample rate your audio device is set to, probably 48 kilohertz. That means 48,000 times a second, your DAW has to put out a piece of data that represents the mixed audio signal. Each plugin reports to the DAW how many samples it takes to process their audio. One plugin may say, I'm going to take 2 samples. Another plugin may take 64 samples to do whatever it is that it does to the audio. This creates a need to time align your channels. And the way a DAW normally handles this is through something called plugin delay compensation, where it delays every channel however much it needs to in order to line it up with the slowest channel. The problem is Reaper doesn't apply delay compensation when the input to a track is being monitored, which is how we are mixing our inputs live. It only applies the delay compensation when you are playing back recorded tracks. So while we do hear the effect of the plugin that we insert on our channels as we monitor the incoming audio on our tracks, our plugins are potentially going to be causing our channels to be out of time alignment with each other. The solution to this is to only use what are called zero latency plugins on your channels. A zero latency plugin processes its audio faster than the sample rate of your audio device. So effectively, it's operating as if there is zero latency added by the plugin. Waves has a nice listing of their plugin latency on their support website, so you can look through and find all the plugins that list zero samples at 48 kilohertz. So there are some really popular Waves plugins that I won't be using because they are not zero latency. All the plugins that I'm going to show you here as we set up our channels are zero latency plugins. Until we get to our master bus, I do use some plugins with latency on my master bus, and we'll talk about that when we get there. In Reaper, you can tell if a plugin has latency by opening the performance meter. That's under the View menu, Performance Meter. And this PDC column is the number of samples needed to process the plugins on each channel. So as long as we keep this at 0 on every channel, our tracks will be time aligned. Let's start with the kick channel. To insert a plugin in Reaper, in this section above the fader there are two areas separated by a little line. Above the line is where you insert plugins, and below the line are channel sends. You can already see the send to the drums bus we created in the routing matrix in the previous video. When I click an empty insert slot, it will open a dialog for you to select from the plugins you have installed on your computer. Reaper creates some folders already to organize your plugins for you by categories and developer. If you come down here to where it says folders, you can create your own folders. Right-click and select Add Folder to create your own. What I've done is I've created a folder called Waves 0 where I have all my zero latency plugins. That way, in the heat of the moment on Sunday morning, I don't accidentally insert a plugin that does have some latency. I know I can pull from this folder safely. To add plugins into this folder, just click and drag a plugin from anywhere else into this folder. For the kick channel, I'm going to start with a Schoeps Omni channel. And you'll see there is a mono and stereo version. It's important to use the appropriate one for your track, or it could create an issue with the stereo image. This is a mono channel coming from Dante, so we'll use the mono plugin. I'll show you later when we get to our guitars how we deal with stereo channels. The Schoeps Omni channel is what's called a channel strip plugin, so it has a preamp section, EQ, a de-esser that you can use more like a multiband compressor, a compressor, and a gate, all of that in one plugin. The other thing I really like about this plugin is the presets are a really great starting point. So for our kick drum, I like the Andrew Schoeps Kick 2. Then I'll usually insert another EQ after that. My go-to EQ plugin is the Waves F6. And with this plugin, I'll take out a nice wide scoop around 250 Hz to tighten up the kick sound and make room for other instruments. On the snare, I'll put another Schoeps Omni with the Andrew Schoeps Snare 2 preset. Then for my snare drum, I use the de-essers to take out a little bit of low end at about 130 Hz. I don't want it muddying up that area where the kick and bass will be. Next, we're going to create a snare plate reverb through a send to another channel. So with the snare channel selected, I'll press Ctrl T to create a new track right after it, and I'll name this snare plate. We'll insert the H-Reverb stereo plugin, and these are the reverb settings I'm using for the snare plate reverb. And now I have to route two things: the input from the snare channel and the output where this channel is going to go. I could do all of that from the routing matrix, but there are many ways to do the same thing when it comes to routing in Reaper. So for routing just one channel, let me show you a few methods that make this really quick. To create a send from one channel to another, all you have to do is click and drag from the send area of the source track and drop it on the track you want to create the send to. Now my snare channel is sending its audio to the snare plate channel. And if we click on the route button of a track, we can see all of its routing. When you create a track, it gets defaulted to the master bus. But for this snare plate, we'll uncheck that and add a new send to the drum bus so all of our drum sounds are going through that one bus. This pull down gives us a list of all of our channels. Find the drum bus and select it, and now it's sending its audio to that bus. This is a pretty big sounding reverb. You'll want to mix it in the context of the mix subtly, so it's just at the point where you don't really notice it distinctly, but if you were to mute it, you could really hear the difference in its mist. Then I like to create a second reverb send for my snare for a longer, darker toned reverb. Create another channel and do all the exact same routing we did for the plate reverb. And for this reverb, I use more of a hall sound. Here are my reverb settings. And I've also got an EQ after this to shape the sound of the reverb and darken it some. Again, mix this reverb in until it's just barely audible, but if you mute it, you'll miss it. On my snare bottom channel, we'll flip the phase on the channel to keep our top and bottom mics in phase with each other, and I'll use another Sheps Omni. And this one I set to this Yode Nevo Snare Drum 3 preset. I only send the bottom channel to the second hall reverb. I don't like what the bottom mic does in the plate reverb sound. And now we can move this channel over so that both my snare channels are before the reverbs. To move a channel in Reaper, just click and drag it. For the hat channel, I've just got a generic EQ plugin with a really aggressive high-pass filter. Then for toms, I'll start with them all pretty much the same. A Sheps Omni with the toms preset, but then I'll go through and adjust the gates a little more aggressive to better match the signal that I'm actually getting in. I'll usually also add another EQ plugin that lets me dial in the overall tone to taste for each drum. Then let's add a track for the toms reverb channel. Route all three of my toms to it, and then of course route this to the drum bus. And for this, I use the Pooch drum kit. And I do put an EQ after with a high-pass filter so we don't get any low end coming from the reverb that would muddy things up. For cymbals, it's just an EQ with a high-pass filter on it. We actually mic each of our cymbals from underneath instead of using overheads, mainly for visual and aesthetic reasons in our environment, but it also means that what I get from the mics is pretty much just the cymbals. I don't necessarily treat these like you would a normal overhead mic. On my drum bus, I'll be honest, I change what plugins I use here quite often and try different things. A good place to start would be with another Shep's Omnichannel, and on the buses, use the stereo versions of the plugins. A good place to start is with the Brad Devins kit preset. I'll also often put an EQ on the drum bus, so I can do some overall tone shaping if I need to. On bass, this is one case where I think a single compressor that is banging away at the signal gives a bass guitar the tone and transient response that I'm looking for. I'll start with F6 to let me shape the tone. And then I'll add a CLA 76. You can start with the Bluey bass preset. That should get your attack and release in the right spot. Then you'll need to adjust the input and output to get the right amount of compression and volume. Turn your input up until every note that's played gets some amount of compression. Then adjust the output to give you the volume you want in your channel. I like to start with my faders around 0, and by 0, I don't mean all the way down. I mean at unity where the fader isn't cutting or boosting. I like to have it there because that gives me the most resolution and control of the volume when I'm making fader adjustments and mixing. So you can use this output knob to kind of calibrate the volume where you want it in your channel. Next I'll add max bass. Some people don't like this plugin, and I think if you had a perfectly recorded bass guitar with the right amount of low end dialed in, maybe miking a really nice bass cabinet or something, yeah, you wouldn't want to use this plugin. But for a live bass that's DI'd into the system, it lets me dial in the right amount of bass tone that I want. If I was mixing this in post-production, I might use the Waves Guitar Cabinet emulator, but it's not zero latency, so you can't use it live. What max bass does is add harmonic content at higher frequencies that gives the listener a perception that there is more bass content, without actually increasing the bass content in your signal. Higher harmonics are added to the frequencies below the frequency setting, and then you can dial in how much of that harmonic audio you want to add. Another reason I like this plugin for a live stream is because a lot of people may be listening on phones or TVs, and this plugin can give a perception of bass even in smaller speakers that can't actually produce those low frequencies. On the acoustic guitar, I've got an F6 again for my EQ to shape the tone I want. Followed by the CLA2A compressor. This compressor has a slower attack that's fixed, there's no timing controls, and I like the way it preserves the attack of the acoustic guitar. With this compressor, the controls are kind of backwards in that this peak reduction knob sets the threshold for when compression starts, and then the gain knob is really just an output gain. It has no influence on the compressor other than its output volume. So set the amount of compression you want, and then just like on the bass, use the gain knob to set the volume of the instrument in your channel. Next on my acoustic guitar, I've got my first non-Waves plugin, but it is a free plugin from Polyverse called Wider, and I'll put a link to where you can get that down in the description of this video. And it does just that, it pushes the stereo image of the guitar out wider, but it does it without inverting the phase between left and right like a lot of stereo widening effects do, so it doesn't cause cancellation if your mix is listened to in mono. With the way that the acoustic guitar is used in most worship music today, it's kind of like a shaker, This kind of pushes it out to the sides and actually lets it be heard more in the mix because it's out of the way of everything else in the middle. If you listen to this in solo, it kind of sounds bad. It messes with your ears. But when you put it in the mix, it brings the acoustic out in a way that it can sit in the mix and be heard without stepping on everything. For my stereo electric guitars, I have two channels, a left and right channel coming in on Dante. I could pan each of these left and right, but then if I want to do any processing at the channel level, I have to use two plugins and match them. There are ways to link plugin settings in Reaper, but what I find not only makes it easier to manage, but also uses less CPU resources, is to make a stereo channel. To do that, on the first channel, pull down the input source here and go to the input stereo option. And this guitar is coming in on channel 13 and 14. So I'm going to select the Dante 1314 input. Now I can actually delete this second channel because I have all my audio for this guitar coming into that one track. Now I can insert just one plugin, and of course I need to select the stereo version of the plugins. So I'm going to insert an F6 stereo. I usually don't do a whole lot on my guitars. They usually have pretty good tones coming from their amp simulators. Maybe just some scoops to make room for other instruments. And for the compressor, a stereo CLA 76. I'll start with the Blackie guitar, and that gets my attack and release in the right spot. Now I'll repeat that process to set up my second guitar as a stereo track. And a nice thing in Reaper is I can just click and drag these plugins that I already set up on my first guitar to the second guitar, and they are copied over with all the same settings. For the synth, I'll set this up as a stereo track as well. And usually I'll just add an EQ here, and to be honest, the sounds coming from our synth are pretty good out of the box as well. I rarely do much even with the EQs that's on there, maybe a high pass filter if it really needs it. On my piano I have two mic channels, but I don't combine these like the guitars because I don't pan them. It's more of a high and low channel. But I do want to process the piano as one instrument, so rather than duplicating all my processing on both channels, I'll add it to the bus. I start with the F6 EQ and that's really it. Piano is one instrument I usually don't like much compression on. Because our piano is actually mic'd and not electronic, and it sits right next to my drums, I have a bit more cleanup work to be done with my EQ than you would on a typical piano. But generally on piano, I'll have a pretty heavy high pass filter and probably even a low shelf taking out a lot of low end depending on how the music is arranged. That just keeps the left hand of the piano out of the way of the bass and sometimes even the electric guitar's way. On my violin, I'll start with the F6 plugin. You can see that I like this EQ plugin. Not only do I like the way it sounds, but it also has dynamic EQ capability as well, which works well on violin. I'll turn on the high pass, then I like to set a band to around 3 or 4K, and I'll bring the range down to about 3 dB, and now bring the threshold down so that when he really soars on some of those notes, it keeps that range in check. The nice thing about dynamic EQ is that it's not always cutting those frequencies. It only cuts them by the amount you set in the range after it's reached the threshold. On vocals, you guessed it, another F6 EQ. And then I'm going to run each vocal into two compressors. First, the CLA2A. Set the peak reduction so that you're getting some gain reduction on just about every phrase when the singer is singing at normal volume. Then we'll add the CLA76. And start with the bluey vocal setting. That will get our attack and release in the right place. Then you'll need to adjust the input on this compressor to the right amount of compression. So while I'm watching the gain reduction of the 2A, when its reduction is pushed hard, I want that to begin some gain reduction on the 76. So they aren't necessarily in sync, but when the 2A really starts to dig in, the 76 will catch some of those peaks.
The angels roar for Christ the King. Yeah. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise, oh Lord our God.
And once I've set up my lead vocal, I usually take those settings and copy it to all my vocals and then tweak them individually from there. Now we need to add our vocal effects. And I usually start simple with a short plate and a long haul. So add 2 tracks with Control-T, and I'll call this one Vocal Verb, and we'll add the H Reverb plugin, and I'll start with the large haul preset. And this is where I've tweaked the settings to. Then the second channel we'll call Vocal Plate, and I'll add the Abbey Roads Plates plugin. For vocals, I like the B setting and the damper about 4, bass cut all the way up, and I'll increase the pre-delay to about 25 milliseconds. Now for our routing, just like we did on our snare channel, click and drag a send from each of our vocal channels to both of these reverbs. And then for the reverbs themselves, I'm going to route them to my vocal bus. When I adjust the overall volume of my vocals, I want the reverb volume going up and down with the vocals as well. So click the route button and unassign it from the master and add a send to the vocal bus. I also like to color all of my effects channels so that they stand out and I can find them quickly. I usually make all of my effects channels this pink color. On my vocal bus, I use the Pugchild 670 stereo compressor. And when the vocals are really going, set the threshold to give you about 2 or 3 dB of compression. This is a really transparent compressor that just does a great job of gluing your vocals together. I do want to show you something I set up for another church this past week for vocals. While here at our church we have maybe 3 or 4 vocalists that all trade off who may be leading from song to song, at this particular church they will have 1 lead vocalist and then a lot of singers designated as backing vocals. And I set up a template for them a little differently, so let me show you what I did for that. For their vocals, I created 2 buses, a lead vocal and a background vocal bus. And on the background vocal bus, I not only pushed the bus compressor a little harder by setting the threshold lower, which helps to balance out the volume of all the background vocals better, I also added this VEQ4, which is a really nice sounding EQ for very broad tonal adjustments. We'll actually use this plugin in a minute for our mix bus as well. Set this middle band to 1K and listen as I take out about 5 or 6 dB, sometimes even more, but listen how it pushes the background vocals back in the mix and sets them off from the lead vocal just with a simple EQ adjustment. Then of course I do also have a separate reverb for the background vocals with a longer tail and darker tone.
We sing to you, Jesus, as your word, let it rise at the praises of our King. Yeah.
So just an example of a different way that you may want to set up your vocals. All right, back to my template. For my AR or audience response mics, I have a whole video about how I process them more in depth, but to be honest, lately I've just been panning each mic pair all the way left and right. And then on the bus, I've got an EQ with a very generous high-pass filter, so we're not adding any bass frequencies from these mics. And then a bit of tonal shaping, and that's it. You could add a compressor on there to act as a limiter if you were concerned about any peaks coming through, but usually the gain structure of crowd mics is such that what I'm trying to pull out from them are the peaks, so adding a compressor would just bring up the noise floor of the PA and other sounds that I don't really want. And now on the master bus, my mix bus, you can insert plugins here just like on a channel. The magic sauce that I've come up with for the master bus starts with the CLA Mixdown plugin. And I usually use this with no adjustments, just on its default settings. Then the Aphex Vintage Exciter, and set that to the Mastering Dark Mix preset. And then I'll also turn this down to about 5. Then after that, a VEQ4, and I set this middle band to 220 Hz and take out about 4 dB. Then I follow that up with the L2 compressor, and I'll show you how to set this more in depth in another video where we're going to talk about getting the right volume level sent to our video. But let's listen to what this signal chain does for our mix. I'll start with them all bypassed and then add each one in.
Last days we will sing your praise, oh Lord, our God. Praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise His name forevermore, for endless days.
It just opens up the mix and adds more depth and air to it. And the CLA Mixdown adds another layer of compression to keep our volume levels consistent. Now we're to the point where I'd say we're ready to start mixing, making balance adjustments on our buses, tonal adjustments with our EQ, and getting our compressors dialed in while the whole band is playing. All of that is going to be specific to your situation. So now the final thing we need to talk about, and maybe the most important part of this video, is managing CPU usage. All of these plugins are using our CPU to do their processing, and attempting to do it at 0 latency, or as we know, that means faster than our sample rate. And at some point, as you keep loading in plugins, your CPU is going to give out and won't be able to keep up, and you'll start getting audio dropouts. But how do you know how close you are to that point? Or what do you do if you're having dropouts? Let's go back to our performance meter from the View menu. And the first thing we need to do is right-click and make sure you have this Display Real-Time Longest Block Processing Time checked. And that will add this measurement here. The time on the right side of the slash is how much time our CPU has to process all of the audio before a dropout occurs. And the time on the left of the slash is how much time it's actually taking. As long as this number on the left is lower than the number on the right, we're safe. We actually don't even want it to be the same or even close. You could be dropping a sample here and there and not really notice it audibly, but a little bump in CPU usage somewhere else on your computer and you could get a dropout, and so obviously we want to avoid that. If your number on the left is higher or really close to the number on the right, there are 2 things you can do to fix it. The first is to lower the number on the left by decreasing the number of plugins you have, or finding and replacing plugins that take up a lot of CPU with ones that use less CPU. Some plugins are just the CPU hog and aren't suited for live mixing. The second fix we can do is to increase the amount of time we have to do the processing, so increase the number on the right. To do that, we'll go back to Preferences, and back to our audio device, and we'll adjust this block size setting. The block size is a sample buffer. The default is usually 512, which means the DAW is going to buffer for 512 samples. If we double that to 1024, click OK and go back to our performance meter, you can see that we've increased the amount of time we have for the DAW to complete all of its plugin processing. Now, this doesn't come for free. What we're doing is increasing the total throughput latency, the total time from when sound enters our computer until it's sent out again. So there is a limit to how much you can keep increasing the block size, otherwise you'll start having audio and video sync issues. You can calculate how much latency this block size is adding. Divide the block size by the sample rate, so 1024 divided by 48 is 21.3 milliseconds of latency. A typical frame of video at 24 frames per second is 41.6 milliseconds, or at 30 frames per second, that's 33.3 milliseconds. So we're still less than a frame of video in latency at a block size of 1024 and sample rate of 48 kilohertz. I hope you found this video helpful. In the next video, we'll go through and replace all of these Waves plugins with free plugins and see what that sounds like. Until next time, bye.